cold, barren moon loomed beneath the hovering transport vessel, its surface a patchwork of jagged rocks, dry dust, and deep, ominous crevices. The only signs of life on this desolate wasteland were the clusters of students standing inside the landing chamber, awaiting their descent. Inside the reinforced observation deck of the Galactic Academy's test shuttle, Professor Zur observed his students with a keen, analytical gaze. His elongated fingers tapped rhythmically against the control panel as his twin, iridescent eyes narrowed. This was no ordinary assignment. This was the ultimate survival test, designed to push his students beyond the limits of their physical endurance, their mental resilience, and their species' evolutionary advantages. Alan Rivera, the only human in the class, stood among the varied assembly of alien students, his expression unreadable. He had spent years studying alongside them, absorbing their advanced knowledge in physics, xenobiology, and planetary engineering, yet he remained distinctly different. He lacked the hardened exoskeletons of the Vorthix, the natural bioluminescence of the Ylvarians, or the photosynthetic capabilities of the Sylvari. Compared to his classmates, he was physically unimpressive, shorter than most with neither claws nor natural armor. He had no telepathic communication, no ability to detect radiation, no capacity to produce energy from the sun. By all logical assessments, he was at a disadvantage. The students had been briefed about the test weeks in advance. They would be dropped onto the moon's surface with only a limited set of supplies: a knife, a thermal blanket, and a multi-purpose scanner. There would be no food, no additional water sources beyond what they could extract, and no external assistance. The goal was simple: survive for 7 days. Those who failed to adapt would be retrieved, but would receive an automatic failing mark in the course. A low-frequency alarm signaled the countdown to descent. The chamber doors hissed open, revealing a long, narrow ramp extending toward the dusty terrain below. One by one, the students stepped forward, their expressions ranging from confidence to apprehension. The Vorthix moved with an air of superiority, their thick exoskeletons shielding them from the harsh winds as they marched ahead, their multi-jointed limbs moving fluidly over the uneven ground. The Ylvarians, translucent-skinned and agile, flickered in and out of visibility as they adjusted to the environment's temperature. The Sylvari hesitated momentarily before stepping forward, their vine-like appendages curling inward as they assessed the soil composition. Alan was the last to step onto the surface. The moment his boots met the ground, he inhaled deeply, noting the thin, dry air. It was breathable, but barely. The temperature hovered at an uncomfortable low, likely to drop further once the sun set. The sky was a deep shade of burnt orange, the distant light of a dying star casting eerie shadows against the jagged rock formations. The air carried no moisture. Hydration would be an immediate issue. The transport vessel lifted off, leaving them completely alone. Within moments, the scattered students began splitting into their respective groups. Alan remained where he was, scanning the environment with a careful eye. He knew the others expected him to fail. He had heard the murmurs in the academy halls, the whispers about how a species as fragile as humanity had no place in a course designed for survival experts. He could almost hear their unspoken thoughts now. What can he do? What advantage does he possibly have? He wasn't sure they would ever understand. The greatest advantage humanity had was not physical. It was mental. It was adaptability. A distant commotion pulled his attention toward a gathering of students already engaged in conflict. The Vorthix had begun laying claim to an area near a cluster of jagged boulders. Their leader, a hulking figure named Korvac, growling in his deep guttural tongue. Alan had interacted with him before. Korvac was aggressive, fiercely territorial, and believed in dominance through sheer force. The Sylvari, more passive in nature, had attempted to settle in the same region, believing the boulders would offer protection from the winds. The disagreement escalated quickly. Korvac shoved one of the Sylvari aside, his plated arm easily knocking the slender alien to the ground. The others quickly retreated, unwilling to challenge him. Alan shook his head. It was beginning exactly as he expected: panic, chaos, and competition rather than strategy. The first mistake in any survival situation was to let instinct override logic. He turned away from the conflict and moved toward higher ground. His priority was not to fight over scraps, but to assess his surroundings. Reaching the top of a small ridge, he pulled out his multi-purpose scanner and activated its environmental analysis mode. The readings confirmed his initial assessment. The planet had no standing water, but the underground layers held traces of frozen deposits. If he could reach them, he could create a sustainable source of hydration. The terrain was rough, but with the right tools, it could be shaped into something livable. The challenge wasn't surviving. It was building something that could last. Below, the others struggled. The Elvarians attempted to burrow into the rocky ground, but without the proper tools, their tunnels collapsed within minutes. The Vorthics, despite their brute strength, lacked the patience for planning, opting instead to hoard supplies they had scavenged from the terrain. The Sylvari, though intelligent, were too passive, unwilling to engage in direct confrontation, which left them vulnerable. Alan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. This wasn't just a survival test, it was an opportunity. He had spent years in the academy watching his classmates excel in fields where humans were considered inferior. Now he had the chance to show them what his species was truly capable of. He removed a small rock from the ground and studied its texture. Porous yet sturdy. Potentially useful. He glanced at the boulders the others were fighting over and shook his head. Those weren't the best materials for shelter. There were better options in the valley beyond the ridge, where natural formations created a windbreak and the underground water supply was more accessible. If he moved quickly, he could set up before nightfall. Alan tightened his grip on the scanner and took his first step toward the valley. He didn't need brute strength or advanced alien biology. He had something far more valuable: knowledge, patience, and the ability to adapt. And he was about to prove that a human could do more than just survive. He could thrive. Alan moved swiftly down the ridge, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he navigated the uneven terrain. The valley ahead stretched into the distance, a vast expanse of rocky formations and deep fissures that hinted at underground water deposits. The air grew colder as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting elongated shadows that made the landscape appear even more desolate. He had little time before nightfall. His scanner confirmed what he had suspected. Beneath the hardened surface there were traces of frozen water, likely remnants from an ancient glacial period. If he could extract it, he wouldn't have to rely on the limited moisture available in the atmosphere. He glanced back toward the plateau where the others remained. The Vorthics had solidified their claim over the jagged rock outcrop, while the Elvarians had retreated to the northern edge of the test site, their bodies flickering as they adjusted to the cooling temperatures. The Sylvari had scattered, likely searching for a suitable location away from conflict. None of them seemed to have formulated a long-term strategy. Alan adjusted his grip on his multi-tool and pressed forward, scanning for an ideal spot to begin. The valley walls provided natural wind resistance, reducing exposure to the elements. More importantly, the layered rock formations suggested pockets of trapped ice. He knelt beside one of the fissures and activated the tool's laser function, cutting away a thin layer of stone. A glimmer of frost reflected under the scanner's light. He had found it. He worked methodically, using controlled pulses of heat to melt the ice without evaporating it. Soon, droplets formed, trickling into a small indentation he had carved into the rock. He cupped the gathered water in his hands, taking a cautious sip. It was cold, metallic from the mineral deposits, but safe. Hydration was secured. Now he needed shelter. A low rumble echoed in the distance. He tensed, scanning the horizon. The ground vibrated faintly beneath his feet. A dust cloud rose beyond the ridge. Something large was moving. His mind raced through possibilities. The test parameters hadn't mentioned native life forms, but that didn't mean there weren't any. If there was movement, there was either danger or opportunity. He had to find out which. He moved quickly but cautiously, keeping low as he navigated toward the source of the disturbance. The ridge provided a natural vantage point. He climbed carefully, peering over the edge. Below, a massive insectoid creature lumbered through the rocky expanse, its chitinous body reflecting the dim light of the setting sun. Segmented legs moved in a rhythmic pattern, its mandibles clicking as it scraped against the rock formations. Alan's mind worked rapidly. The creature was clearly a scavenger, drawn to something within the valley. It wasn't moving with the aggression of a predator, but its sheer size made it dangerous. He observed its movements, noting how it probed certain areas before moving on. It was searching for something specific: water, minerals, heat. If he could determine its pattern, he could use it to his advantage. He watched as the creature paused near a cluster of boulders, pressing its mandibles against the ground. A moment later, it withdrew, shifting direction. Alan exhaled slowly. It was detecting underground pockets, likely the same ones he had located earlier. If it was drawn to those areas, it meant the valley was richer in resources than he had anticipated. A sharp crack split the air. His head snapped toward the sound. Further up the ridge, two figures stood silhouetted against the darkening sky: Korvac and one of his Vorthik subordinates. They had followed him. Alan remained motionless, watching as Korvac gestured toward the valley below. The subordinate hesitated before nodding. The massive alien began his descent, moving with surprising agility for his size. Alan narrowed his eyes. They had seen the creature. They knew there was something valuable here. He clenched his jaw. He had no interest in unnecessary conflict, but he also wasn't about to let Korvac claim the entire valley. He had to act first. He slid down the ridge, landing in a crouch before sprinting toward the fissure he had been working on. He increased the intensity of the multi-tool's heat function, accelerating the water extraction process. If he could secure enough before Korvac reached him, he could establish his claim. Heavy footfalls approached. He didn't look up. He focused on his task. A shadow loomed over him. "You work fast, human," Korvac rumbled. His deep voice carried the faintest trace of amusement. Alan stood slowly, meeting the Vorthik's gaze. Efficiency is key in survival. Korvac's mandibles twitched. "You found water." Alan didn't answer. Korvac exhaled, the plates on his chest expanding slightly. "You intend to keep it?" Alan wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. "That depends. Are you here to take it by force?" Korvac studied him for a moment before shifting his gaze to the valley. "This place is rich, more than I expected." Alan nodded. "There's enough for more than one settlement, but if you start hoarding, you'll waste resources instead of using them." Korvac tilted his head. "And what do you propose?" Alan glanced toward the massive creature still lumbering through the valley. "We work smarter." Korvac let out a low hum, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Alan exhaled slowly. The test had only just begun, but the real challenge was no longer just survival, it was control. The cold wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the dry scent of mineral-rich dust. Alan stood motionless, his pulse steady as he watched Korvac retreat up the ridge. The Vorthik had left without a threat, without a challenge, but not without interest. He had seen the potential in the valley, the abundance of resources, and Alan knew that meant he would return. Whether as an ally or a competitor remained to be seen. Alan turned back to the fissure. The water he had extracted now pooled in a small depression he had carved out of the stone. He took a measured sip, the cool liquid cutting through the dryness in his throat. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He needed to move fast. The valley was promising, but only if he could secure it before others came looking. The scanner in his hand flickered, displaying a temperature drop warning. Night was closing in. The thin atmosphere of the moon provided little insulation, and without a proper shelter, the cold would become lethal. He needed warmth, and he needed it now. He scanned the surrounding rock formations, searching for natural insulation. A cave would be ideal, but the valley had little in the way of deep crevices. Instead, he settled on a series of large, weathered boulders pressed together at odd angles. The gaps between them formed natural windbreaks, and with a little effort, he could enclose a small space. He got to work immediately, using the multi-tool to break apart smaller rocks and wedge them into the openings. His movements were quick and precise. This wasn't the first time he had built a shelter under pressure. Growing up in harsh environments back on Earth had taught him the value of working efficiently. Every action needed to serve a purpose. Once the structure was enclosed enough to block the worst of the wind, he moved on to the next critical component: heat. Fire was out of the question. The moon's atmosphere had no oxygen, and while some alien species had adapted to survive without combustion, he had no such luxury. Instead, he turned to a different source: thermal conduction. He retrieved the scanner and adjusted it to map heat signatures. The valley floor retained residual warmth from the planet's distant sun, but more importantly, the rock formations stored energy. If he could harness that, he could create a stable heat source. Using the multi-tool, he began carving shallow trenches around the base of his shelter, forming a series of interconnected pathways. When he activated the heating function on the tool, the rock absorbed the energy, slowly radiating warmth. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would be enough to keep him alive through the night. As he finished securing the last of the thermal lines, a sharp noise echoed through the valley. Alan tensed, his grip tightening around the multi-tool. He recognized the sound immediately: stone shifting under sudden pressure. Someone was approaching. He moved quickly, taking cover behind one of the larger boulders. The dim light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, making it difficult to see clearly. He adjusted his scanner, switching to motion detection. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was one of the Sylvari, their slender form moving carefully across the rocky terrain. The bioluminescent veins running along their arms pulsed faintly, a sign of exertion. Alan remained still, watching as the alien approached his water source. The Sylvari knelt beside the fissure, dipping a hand into the pool Alan had carved. They hesitated for a moment before glancing around, as if expecting someone to stop them. When no one did, they cupped the water and brought it to their lips. Alan stepped forward. "You should ask before taking what isn't yours." The Sylvari startled, nearly dropping the water. Their eyes, large and reflective, locked onto him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the Sylvari straightened. "You found this first," they said, their voice soft but steady. Alan nodded. "That's how survival works." The Sylvari's gaze flicked to the trenches, the glowing warmth of the heated rock catching their attention. "You built this?" Alan studied them carefully. "You're looking for a place to stay?" The Sylvari hesitated. "The others?" "They fight over space. They take what they want." Alan exhaled slowly. He had expected this. The Vorthix would hoard, the Alvarians would isolate, and the Sylvari would be left with whatever remained. "If you want to stay here," he said finally, "then you work for it." The Sylvari considered his words before nodding. "What do you need?" Alan motioned toward the valley. "More water. I can't collect it alone." The Sylvari nodded again, this time with more certainty. "I can help." Alan stepped aside, watching as the Sylvari moved toward the fissure. He didn't trust them yet, not entirely. But survival wasn't just about strength. It was about knowing when to form alliances, and if the others came looking for a fight, he would be ready. The night had been long, the cold relentless. Alan sat inside the crude shelter he had constructed, listening to the faint hum of heated stones radiating warmth through the air. The Sylvari, who had introduced himself as Vael, rested nearby, his luminescent veins dim as he conserved energy. Neither had spoken much through the night. There was no need. Both understood the value of silence in an unforgiving environment. As the first light of the distant sun crept over the horizon, Alan rose, stretching his stiff limbs. The air was still frigid, but the worst had passed. He stepped outside, scanning the landscape. The valley remained quiet, the jagged rock formations casting long shadows across the ground. The others had yet to make their move, but that would change soon. He knew Korvac was watching, waiting for the right moment to return. He had no doubt that the Vorthik would come back, either to claim territory or to take resources by force. Alan crouched beside the water fissure, checking the flow. More ice had formed overnight, as he had expected. He activated the multi-tool, applying low heat to melt a fresh supply. He filled one of the makeshift containers he had fashioned from hollowed-out stones, handing it to Vale, who accepted it with a nod of gratitude. "We need more than this," Alan said, wiping the condensation from his fingers. "If we want to stay ahead, we have to dig deeper." Vale ran his fingers along the edge of the fissure, his vine-like appendages twitching as he assessed the mineral content. "There is more beneath, but the ground is dense. It will take time to reach it." Alan nodded, already considering solutions. He could try drilling into the rock using the high-intensity mode on his multi-tool, but that would drain power quickly. He needed a more sustainable method. His gaze drifted toward the valley floor where he had observed the massive insectoid creature the previous evening. It had been drawn to the underground deposits, sensing them with remarkable accuracy. If he could lure it back, he might be able to use its movements to his advantage. He turned back to Vale. "That creature from last night, do your people know what it is?" Vale's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It is called a gravarn. My people encountered them on the outer moons of the Cassian Belt. They burrow through rock to extract minerals." Alan's mind raced. That was exactly what he needed. "Do they respond to specific stimuli?" Vale hesitated before answering. "Heat, vibrations, strong magnetic fields." He glanced at Alan warily. "You want to attract it? If we control where it digs, we control the water supply," Alan explained. "It could do in hours what would take us days." Vale considered this before nodding slowly. "It is a risk, but a calculated one," Alan smirked. "That's how I like my risks." They worked quickly, gathering supplies and setting up near a secondary fissure further down the valley. This one was shallower, but the rock composition suggested a richer deposit below. Alan modified his multi-tool, adjusting the settings to emit a low-frequency vibration. If Vale was right, it would be enough to draw the creature back. As the device activated, a faint tremor passed through the ground. Alan and Vale remained still, waiting. Minutes passed. Then, the deep, rhythmic thudding of approaching footsteps echoed through the valley. Alan exhaled slowly. "Here we go." The gravarn appeared over the ridge, its enormous frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Its mandibles clicked, sensing the vibrations. Slowly, it moved toward the fissure, testing the ground with cautious steps. Alan tightened his grip on the multi-tool, ready to shut it off if things went wrong. The creature hesitated for a moment, then lowered its head, using its powerful limbs to scrape away layers of rock. The process was slower than he had hoped, but it was working. The ground trembled as the fissure widened, exposing deeper veins of ice. Vale watched intently. "If it breaks too much, we may not be able to contain the collapse." Alan adjusted the vibration settings, reducing the frequency. The gravarn slowed, its movements becoming more controlled. He grinned. "We're guiding it." For the next hour they worked in silence, carefully regulating the creature's digging patterns. When they finally deactivated the device, the fissure had deepened significantly, revealing a substantial water source. Alan knelt beside it, testing the purity. The water was rich with minerals, but safe to drink. Vale crouched beside him. "You did it." Alan exhaled, feeling the weight of success settle over him. "We did it." Before he could say more, a sharp voice cut through the air. "So, this is what you've been up to." Alan turned. Korvac stood at the edge of the ridge, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't alone. Two other Vorthiks stood behind him, their postures tense. Alan rose to his feet, meeting Korvac's gaze. "You here to watch or to claim?" Korvac's mandibles twitched. "That depends. are you offering? Alan glanced at Vale, then back at Korvac. He had known this moment would come. The real question was, would Korvac see reason, or was this about to turn into a fight? Either way, Alan was ready. Alan stood his ground, his gaze locked onto Korvac's unblinking, multifaceted eyes. The Vorvek's mandibles twitched slightly, an indication of restrained aggression. The two Vorveks behind him remained still, their expressions neutral but their postures tense, ready to act at their leader's command. Alan knew that if this confrontation turned violent, the advantage would not be his. The Vortheks were stronger, their thick exoskeletons providing natural armor, and their predatory instincts made them formidable fighters. But brute strength wasn't everything. He crossed his arms, keeping his stance casual but firm. This valley has enough resources for more than one group. But if you try to take it by force, you'll just waste them. Korvac tilted his head slightly. And if I decide to take control anyway? Alan let out a slow breath. Then you'll have to deal with the Grivarn. Korvac's gaze flicked toward the massive insectoid creature still burrowing into the rock. It had slowed its digging but remained near the fissure, occasionally clicking its mandibles as it processed the minerals it had uncovered. It was no mindless beast. It had learned that this was a place where resources could be found, and it would likely return in search of more. Alan pressed on. If you disrupt what we've built here, you'll be on your own when it comes back. And it will come back. Korvac was silent for a moment, then exhaled through his nostrils. You're a manipulative one, human. Alan shrugged. I prefer strategic. Korvac turned to his subordinates, exchanging a brief, wordless communication. Then, after a long pause, he looked back at Alan. You're right. Fighting over this will only weaken us. But make no mistake, this is not an alliance. It's an arrangement. Alan nodded. Fine by me. Vale, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke. If we work together, we can establish something sustainable. With a structured water system and proper heat distribution, survival will no longer be a struggle. Korvac let out a low growl. And what do you propose, Silvari? Vale gestured toward the trenches Alan had carved into the valley floor. The rock here retains heat well. If we expand the system, we can create a thermal grid that will stabilize the temperature during the cold cycles. Water distribution can be regulated so that no one is left without. Korvac listened, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he nodded. Fine. But I won't take orders from a human or a Silvari. Alan smirked. Good. Because I'm not giving any. Korvac studied him for a long moment before stepping back. We will return with supplies. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his subordinates following close behind. Alan exhaled, only now realizing how tense his body had been. That had gone better than expected. Vielle glanced at him. You took a risk. Alan grinned. That's what humans do. They wasted no time. With Korvac's reluctant cooperation, the next few days were spent reinforcing their settlement. More trenches were dug, forming an intricate system of heat circulation that kept the valley livable even during the coldest hours of the night. The water supply, now properly controlled, was rationed fairly, ensuring that no one had to fight for survival. The other students who had initially scattered across the moon in their own desperate attempts to endure began to take notice. Slowly, they approached, drawn by the stability Alan and Vale had created. Some came in small groups, hesitant but willing to cooperate. Others, like the Yelvarians, remained distant observers, preferring to watch from the outskirts before committing. Alan didn't force anyone to join. He knew that real leadership wasn't about commanding. It was about proving that working together was better than working alone, and that proof was becoming undeniable. By the time the Galactic Academy's transport vessel returned to retrieve them, the valley had transformed. What had once been a barren wasteland was now a functioning settlement. It wasn't just a place where people had survived. It was a place where they had thrived. Professor Zyra stood on the observation deck of the shuttle, his iridescent eyes scanning the valley with a mixture of curiosity and something that almost resembled admiration. When Alan boarded, the professor studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You did more than endure, Mr. Rivera," Alan shrugged. "That was the assignment, wasn't it?" Zaire's mandibles twitched. "The assignment was survival. What you built was something more." Alan smirked. "Humans like to overachieve." The professor inclined his head slightly. "Indeed." He glanced back at the valley one last time before turning toward the control panel. "Your results will be reviewed by the council, but I suspect you will find yourself at the top of the rankings." Alan leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "I wasn't in it for the rankings." Zaire gave him a thoughtful look. "No, I don't believe you were." As the shuttle lifted off, Alan looked out at the valley below. The trenches, the shelters, the organized systems, it was all still there, a testament to what had been accomplished. And in the end, it hadn't been the strongest who had survived. It had been the ones who had adapted,